Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm doing something a little different. I just finished reading Robert Kiyosaki's book, Why Students Work for Students, and I have to tell you, this book stirred up a lot of thoughts for me. Some I agree with, some I definitely don't, and I'm going to walk you through all of it in this comprehensive review. Now, if you're not familiar with Robert Kiyosaki, he's the author of the mega bestseller Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which has sold over 30 million copies worldwide. That book fundamentally changed how millions of people think about money, work, and financial education. This book, Why Students Work for Students, is essentially his manifesto for parents. It's about financial education, yes, but it's really about preparing your children for a world that our traditional education system is completely failing to address. And let me be clear from the start. This is a controversial book. Kiyosaki doesn't pull punches. He directly challenges some of our most sacred beliefs about education, success, and what it means to prepare children for the future, whether you agree with him or not. And trust me, I found myself disagreeing with him on several points. You can't deny that he raises questions that desperately need to be asked. So here's what I'm going to do. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through what I learned from reading this entire book. I'll break down his main arguments, share the frameworks he presents, tell you what I think works, what doesn't work, and ultimately who should read this book and who should probably skip it. Before we dive in, let me tell you why I decided to read this book. I've been thinking a lot lately about education, particularly financial education, and how unprepared most people are for the real-world challenges of money. I mean, we graduate students who can recite Shakespeare and solve calculus equations, but they don't understand credit card interest or how to budget. That's insane. So when I saw that Kiyosaki had written an entire book addressing this specific problem, aimed specifically at parents, I had to read it. The book is structured in 4 main parts. Part 1 asks whether schools are actually preparing children for the real world. Part 2 offers alternative perspectives on intelligence, success, and wealth. Part 3 promises to give your child unfair advantages through financial education. And Part 4, which is pretty bold, is called Be the Fed, essentially teaching how to print your own money legally. Now, the title itself, Why Students Work for Students, is provocative. It's designed to make you stop and think. And Kiyosaki backs this up with research and anecdotes throughout the book. But I want to be upfront with you. This isn't just a feel-good book about how everyone's special in their own way. This is a detailed, sometimes technical, often challenging book about capitalism, entrepreneurship, and preparing children for economic realities that most parents don't even understand themselves. All right, let's dive in. Kiyosaki starts the book with what he calls Awaken Your Child's Financial Genius. And he immediately hits you with a simple but profound question. Why isn't money taught in school? Day after day, he says, teachers drummed into our heads go to school to get a job. But if the reason for getting a job is to make money, why not just teach us about money directly? What I found interesting was how he frames this through the lens of the emperor's new clothes. That old Danish fairy tale, where everyone pretends the emperor is wearing beautiful clothes when he's actually naked, because they're afraid to admit they can't see the clothes. Kiyosaki argues that our education system is that naked emperor. Everyone knows it's failing to prepare kids for the real world, but no one wants to admit it. Now, he brings in some fascinating research here. Dr. Frank Luntz, a respected American pollster, asked people if they'd rather be a business owner employing 100 people or a CEO of a Fortune 500 company employing 10,000. Get this, 80% chose to be the business owner. People want to be entrepreneurs. But our school system, Kiyosaki argues, is training kids to be employees. And this is where the book starts to get controversial. He doesn't just say the education system needs reform. He argues it's fundamentally designed to produce employees, not entrepreneurs. He quotes Dr. Luntz saying, forget about MBAs. Most business schools teach you how to be successful in a big corporation rather than start your own company. As I read this, I had to pause and think. Is he right? I mean, look at the most successful entrepreneurs of our generation. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, even Kiyosaki himself. None of them completed traditional 4-year college programs. They dropped out to pursue their visions. Does that mean college is useless? No, of course not. But it does raise an important question about what we're actually teaching and whether it aligns with what people actually want to do with their lives. But here's where the book gets really interesting. Kiyosaki introduces what he calls the cash flow quadrant. This is one of his signature concepts, and if you've read any of his books, you've probably encountered this before. He divides the world of income into 4 quadrants. E for employee, people who work for others. S for self-employed, people who work for themselves. B for big business, entrepreneurs with 500+ employees. I for investor, people whose money works for them. And the core argument of the entire book revolves around this quadrant. He says schools prepare people exclusively for the E and S quadrants, but true wealth and financial freedom exist in the B and I quadrants. And here's the kicker. People in different quadrants pay vastly different tax rates. Employees in the E quadrant pay the highest taxes. Professionals in the S quadrant pay even more, while big business owners and investors in the B and I quadrants pay the least. Now, I'll be honest with you. When I first encountered this framework, I was skeptical. It seemed too simplistic. But as I continued reading and he provided examples and explained the tax code, I started to see his point. He's not saying everyone should be an entrepreneur or that being an employee is somehow shameful. What he's saying is that our education system should at least expose children to all 4 quadrants and let them make informed choices. One of the most powerful sections in this first part deals with what Kiyosaki calls the 4 800-pound gorillas that today's children will face. These are massive problems that our generation is passing on to the next. Gorilla number 1, the new problem of growing old. He points out that in 1935, when Social Security was created, 65 was considered old age. Today, 65 is the new 45, and people might live to 90 or even 120. The Social Security Fund is projected to be bankrupt by 2033. How will governments afford to keep an aging population housed, fed, and provided with medical care? Gorilla number 2, accelerating national debt. In 2000, U.S. national debt was $5.5 trillion. By 2012, when he wrote this, it had grown to over $16 trillion. Today, in 2024, it's over $34 trillion. To put that in perspective, if you started spending $1 million every single day since the time of Christ, you still wouldn't have spent $1 trillion. Gorilla number 3, the new depression. Kiyosaki argues we're not in a temporary recession, but a new type of depression, one that could last 25 years or more, similar to the Great Depression that lasted from 1929 to 1954. Gorilla number 4, higher taxes. Every time central banks print money, taxes and inflation go up. These are essentially double taxes on the poor and middle class. These gorillas, he argues, are going to be your child's problem, and schools aren't preparing them for any of it. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this just fear-mongering? Maybe. But here's what struck me as I read this section. Whether or not you agree with his specific predictions, can anyone honestly argue that our children aren't facing significant economic challenges that previous generations didn't face? Student loan debt is crushing young adults. Home ownership is increasingly out of reach. Pension plans are disappearing. These are real problems. Kiyosaki then introduces his concept of windows of learning. And this is where the book starts to get more practical and less political. He argues there are 3 critical windows of learning in a child's development. Window 1, birth to age 12, quantum learning. This is when a child's brain is like clay, absorbing everything. This is when neural pathways are formed. After age 12, the brain starts to erase parts that haven't formed neural pathways. Use it or lose it. Window 2, age 12 to 24, rebellious learning. During this phase, teenagers learn by rebelling and testing boundaries. They want to make their own decisions. The key challenge is they don't yet understand consequences. Window 3, age 24 to 36, professional learning. This is when people establish themselves professionally, start families, buy homes, and face the financial realities of adult life. What I found fascinating about this framework is how he ties it to financial education. He argues that if you don't start teaching children about money during that first window of learning, during those critical years before age 12, you've missed a crucial opportunity. The neural pathways for financial understanding don't get formed, and it becomes much harder to develop financial intelligence later in life. And this brings us to one of the most controversial chapters in Part 1, Why Valedictorians Fail. Now, that title alone probably made some people want to throw the book across the room. But hear me out on what he's actually arguing. Kiyosaki cites research from Karen Arnold, a professor at Boston University who studied valedictorians and salutatorians from Illinois high schools. Her conclusion? Quote, while these students had the attributes to ensure school success, these characteristics did not necessarily translate into real-world success. She found that valedictorians went on to do well in conventional careers, accounting, medicine, law, engineering, but they weren't the ones changing the world. They were running it competently, but not revolutionizing it. Arnold says something really important. They obey the rules, work hard, and like learning, but they're not the mold breakers. They work best within the system and aren't likely to change it. Now, before any straight-A students get offended, let's be clear about what Kiyosaki is actually saying here. He's not saying academic achievement is bad. He's not saying valedictorians are failures. What he's arguing is that the skills required to get good grades, following instructions, memorizing information, giving teachers the answers they want, are different from the skills required for entrepreneurship and wealth creation. He points out that 33% of people on the Forbes 400 list of wealthiest people didn't start college or dropped out. And the dropouts had an average net worth of $4.8 billion compared to $1.5 billion for college graduates. That's a startling statistic. But here's where I started to push back on Kiyosaki's argument. Yes, some billionaires dropped out of college. But that's survivorship bias, right? For every Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg who dropped out and became a billionaire, there are thousands of people who dropped out and struggled financially. The book doesn't really address that. However, I will say this. Kiyosaki makes a compelling argument using the cone of learning, a framework developed by Dr. Edgar Dale. This shows that we remember 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we see and hear, 70% of what we discuss with others, 80% of what we personally experience, 95% of what we teach others. The top of the cone, doing the real thing, is how we learn best. And Kiyosaki argues that traditional schooling focuses on the bottom of the cone, reading and listening to lectures, which is actually the least effective way to learn and retain information. This is why he's such a big advocate for games as teaching tools. He created the CASHFLOW board game specifically to teach financial concepts through simulation and experience, not just reading about them. And you know what? As I read this section, I had to admit he has a point. Think about what you remember from school. For most of us, we remember the experiments we did in science class, the field trips we took, the projects we built, not the lectures we sat through or the textbooks we read. Now we're getting into some of the more political aspects of the book, and this is where I found myself both agreeing and disagreeing with Kiyosaki in equal measure. He has an entire chapter on the entitlement mentality, and boy, does he not hold back. He starts with the story of Bruce Mockenhorst, a 78-year-old California government retiree who was fighting to keep his pension of $45,073 per month. That's over $500,000 per year, plus $60,000 annually for golf fees and massages. When this was challenged, Mockenhorst claimed it was elder abuse. His justification? I'm from an era where you made as much as you could for as long as you could. Kiyosaki uses this as a jumping-off point to discuss what he sees as a growing entitlement mentality in America and around the world. He argues that Social Security, Medicare, government pensions, and now Obamacare are creating a culture where people expect the government to take care of them rather than taking responsibility for their own financial future. Now, this is where I have to pause and give you my honest reaction. As I read this section, I felt conflicted. On one hand, yes, there are definitely examples of government pensions and benefits that seem excessive and unsustainable. That story about Mockenhorst is outrageous. But on the other hand, Kiyosaki seems to paint with a pretty broad brush here. He lumps together legitimate social safety nets with examples of abuse and corruption. He brings up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, arguing that schools fail students at the second level, safety, which includes security of employment, resources, health, and property. His argument is that without financial education, people can never feel truly safe, so they remain needy and often become greedy. They cling to jobs out of fear, depend on Social Security and Medicare, and never develop true financial independence. There's a quote in the book that really stuck with me. Kiyosaki's rich dad said, "Needy people become greedy people become desperate people, and desperate people do desperate things." I think there's truth in that. But here's where I diverge from Kiyosaki's conclusion. He seems to suggest that almost all government social programs are bad and create dependency. I think that's too simplistic. There's a difference between a safety net and a hammock, right? Some people genuinely need help, and a civilized society should provide that. The question is how we design systems that help those in true need without creating dependency in those capable of self-sufficiency. What I do agree with wholeheartedly is his point about financial education. If schools taught kids about money, about earning, saving, investing, entrepreneurship, taxes, debt, from an early age, fewer people would need government assistance in the first place. That seems obvious, but somehow it's controversial. Kiyosaki then introduces what he calls the 3 types of income, and this is crucial to understanding the rest of the book. Ordinary income. This is paycheck money, the highest taxed of all income types. When you work a job, save money in a bank, or withdraw from a 401k. But dealing with ordinary income. Portfolio income, also called capital gains. This is when you buy something low and sell at high, stocks, real estate, whatever. It's taxed at a lower rate than ordinary income, but still taxed significantly. Passive income. This is cash flow from assets. In monopoly terms, it's the rent you collect from your greenhouses and red hotels. This is taxed at the lowest rate, sometimes even 0%. And here's the fundamental disconnect Kiyosaki identifies. Schools teach kids to work for ordinary income. Financial advisors tell people to invest for portfolio income, but the truly wealthy focus on building passive income. He illustrates this by comparing President Obama and Mitt Romney during the 2012 election. Obama made about $3 million and paid 20.5% in taxes. Romney made $21 million and paid 14% in taxes. Why? Because of the type of income they earned and which quadrant it came from. Obama's income was primarily ordinary and portfolio income from the E and S quadrants. Romney's income came more from the B and I quadrants with different tax treatments. Now, when most people hear this, they get angry. The system is rigged, and Kiyosaki doesn't disagree. But he argues the solution isn't to complain about it or try to tax the rich more. The solution is to understand the system and use it to your advantage. Learn to operate in the B and I quadrants where the tax advantages exist. Is that fair? That's a different question, and one Kiyosaki doesn't really grapple with deeply. He seems to take the position that the system is what it is, so you might as well learn to work within it. I'm not sure that's satisfying from a social justice perspective, but from a practical, here's how you can help your own child succeed perspective, I understand his point. Part 2 of the book is called Another Point of View, and this is where Kiyosaki really digs into the concept of seeing both sides of the coin. He opens with a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. This section is actually my favorite part of the book because it's where Kiyosaki moves beyond just criticizing the education system and starts providing alternative frameworks for thinking about success, wealth, and intelligence. He introduces the concept that every coin has 3 sides: heads, tails, and the edge. Most people, he argues, operate from either heads or tails. They see things as right or wrong, black or white. But intelligent people stand on the edge of the coin where they can see both sides simultaneously. In schools, he points out, there's only one right answer. You're smart if your answers match the teacher's answers. But in real life, there are multiple valid answers to most questions. Life is about waves and course corrections, not straight lines. He gives the example of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. The spacecraft was on the correct trajectory only 5% of the time. The other 95% was course correction. This really resonated with me because it's so true. Think about driving a car. You're constantly making tiny adjustments to the steering wheel. You're never perfectly straight, and that's okay. That's how you actually get where you're going. But in school, we're taught that there's one correct answer, and any deviation is wrong. Kiyosaki then tackles some controversial topics head-on, offering another point of view on each. On report cards, in school, your report card measures academic performance. But in real life, your financial statement is your report card. That's what bankers look at, not your GPA. Yet most people leave school focused entirely on their academic transcript and have no idea how to read a financial statement. On greed. Most people think the rich are greedy. But Kiyosaki argues the opposite, that true capitalists must be generous because the more people they serve, the more successful they become. He points out that when someone creates a business that employs thousands of people and provides products or services that improve lives, that's generosity, not greed. The greedy ones, he argues, are often those demanding government handouts or bloated salaries for minimal work. Now, again, I think this is a bit oversimplified. There are definitely greedy capitalists and generous socialists. It's not as black and white as Kiyosaki presents it, but I appreciate that he's challenging us to think differently about these concepts. On debt, this is probably his most controversial position. Most financial advisors say get out of debt, and debt is bad. Kiyosaki argues the opposite, that debt is the new money and learning to use debt to acquire assets is essential to building wealth. After 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, Kiyosaki explains that the dollar became debt. They're the same thing. So when people say save money, they're really saying save debt. When people say get out of debt, they're missing the entire point of how the modern financial system works. He distinguishes between good debt and bad debt. Bad debt is money you borrow to buy things that lose value or don't produce income. Credit card for consumer purchases, car loans, student loans that don't lead to high-paying jobs. Good debt is money you borrow to acquire assets that produce cash flow and appreciate in value. Rental properties, businesses, investments. As I read this section, I kept thinking, this makes sense mathematically and economically, but it's also incredibly risky if you don't know what you're doing. Kiyosaki acknowledges this somewhat, but I think he underplays the danger. For every successful real estate investor who used debt to build wealth, there are probably 10 people who lost everything because they are over-leveraged. On taxes, here's where Kiyosaki really challenges conventional thinking. Most people see taxes as this unavoidable burden, their largest expense. But he argues that the tax code is actually a series of incentives from the government, rewarding people who do things the government wants done. Want lower taxes? Provide jobs by owning a business. Provide housing by investing in real estate. Produce commodities like food or oil. Use debt to stimulate the economy. The government will reward you with lower taxes because you're doing things they want done but can't do efficiently themselves. This reframing of taxes from punitive to incentive-based really shifted my thinking. I never thought about it that way before. The tax code isn't designed to punish the rich, though many people perceive it that way. It's designed to incentivize certain behaviors that benefit the economy. But here's my criticism. Kiyosaki presents this as if anyone can just decide to operate in the B and I quadrants and take advantage of these tax benefits. In reality, it takes significant capital, knowledge, time, risk tolerance, and often years of losses before you can successfully operate a business or manage investment properties profitably. He makes it sound more accessible than it actually is. On words, Kiyosaki has an entire chapter on the power of words and the language of money. He argues that money has its own language that isn't taught in schools, and if you don't speak this language, you'll always struggle financially. The 7 basic words of money, according to Kiyosaki, are income and the 3 types, expense, assets, liabilities, debt, cash flow, capital gains. He emphasizes that it's not just about knowing definitions. It's about understanding the relationships between these concepts. You can't identify an asset from a liability without understanding cash flow. You can't make intelligent decisions about debt without understanding how it affects your income statement and balance sheet. This section is actually really practical and useful, especially for parents. He's essentially saying, teach your kids these 7 words and the relationships between them, and you've given them a foundation that 95% of other kids won't have. On God and money. This was an interesting chapter where Kiyosaki tackles the spiritual dimension of money. He points out that the Bible talks more about money than any other subject, and different people gravitate toward different verses depending on their economic situation. Poor people like verses about the evils of money. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Middle-class people like verses about contentment. The fear of the Lord leads to life. Then one rests content, untouched by trouble. Rich people like verses like the parable of the talents, where the master rewards the servants who invested and grew his money, but punishes the one who buried it in the ground out of fear. Kiyosaki's point is that your interpretation of religious teachings about money often reflects and reinforces your economic position. And he argues that generosity and service, core values in most religions, are actually at the heart of capitalism done right. The more people you serve, the more wealth you create. Now we're in part 3, where Kiyosaki lays out what he calls the 10 unfair advantages of financial education. This is the practical meat of the book. These are specific advantages that financially educated people have over those who aren't. Unfair advantage number 1, the ability to transform your money and your life. This goes back to the 3 types of income. Most people work for ordinary income their whole lives. Financially educated people learn to transform ordinary income into portfolio and passive income. This is what Steve Jobs did. His salary was $1 per year because he didn't want ordinary income. His wealth came from the portfolio and passive income generated by his Apple stock. Unfair advantage number 2, the ability to be more generous. Kiyosaki argues that financial education leads to generosity because when you understand how wealth is created, you realize it's about serving others. The BI triangle he introduces shows the 8 components of a business: mission, leadership, team, product, legal, systems, communications, and cash flow. To succeed in business, you must provide value to others, create jobs, and solve problems. That's generosity, not greed. Unfair advantage number 3, lower taxes. This comes back to understanding the tax code as incentives. Employees pay 40% or more in taxes. Self-employed professionals pay even more. But big business owners and investors can legally pay 20%, 15%, even 0% if they structure things correctly. It's not cheating. It's doing what the government wants you to do and receiving the incentives they've built into the system. Unfair advantage number 4, use debt to become richer. This is probably the most controversial advantage. Kiyosaki argues that since the dollar is now debt, learning to use debt to acquire income-producing assets is essential. His personal debt is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's all good debt that puts money in his pocket every month through rental properties, businesses, and oil wells. Now, as I read this, I kept thinking, this works if you know what you're doing, but it's also how people lose everything. Kiyosaki does mention that if you're not willing to study and learn how to use debt properly, you should probably avoid it. But I think he underemphasizes the risk here. Unfair advantage number 5, expand your means. Here's where Kiyosaki really challenges conventional financial advice. Most experts say live below your means. Kiyosaki says expand your means. His example, he wanted to buy a $50,000 Porsche. Instead of just buying it, which would make him poorer, or denying himself, which kills the spirit, he found a mini storage business in Texas, bought it, and used the cash flow from that business to pay for the Porsche. The asset bought the liability. Rather than becoming poorer, he became richer because he now owned both the Porsche and the mini storage business producing passive income. I have to say, this concept is brilliant. It requires discipline and financial knowledge, but it fundamentally changes your relationship with money. Instead of, can I afford this? The question becomes, what asset can I acquire that will produce enough cash flow to afford this? Unfair advantage number 6. Increase your emotional intelligence. This is about delayed gratification and having the emotional maturity to invest first and spend later. It's about being able to handle stress, overcome fear, deal with setbacks, and keep going when things get tough. Kiyosaki argues that emotional intelligence is the success intelligence, and it's more important than IQ or academic intelligence. The reason many smart people aren't rich isn't because they lack knowledge. It's because they lack the emotional intelligence to take risks, handle uncertainty, and persist through failure. Unfair advantage number 7. Understand different paths to wealth. Not all millionaires are equal. Kiyosaki breaks down different types. Net worth millionaires. People whose assets minus liabilities equal $1 million or more, but they might have little cash flow. High-income millionaires. People who earn $1 million plus per year, but pay the highest taxes. Inheritance millionaires, lucky sperm club, often lose it by generation 3. Cash flow millionaires, people who receive $1 million or more per year from investments without working. He argues the cash flow millionaire is the best position because debt and taxes work in your favor, not against you. Unfair advantage number 8. Protect your assets. This is about using legal entities like LLCs and corporations to protect wealth from 2 types of predators: the government, taxes, and people, lawsuits. Kiyosaki says, I want nothing in my name. Everything is held in legal structures that provide protection. He shares that once Rich Dad Poor Dad became successful, the lawsuits came from friends, business partners, and opportunists. Without proper asset protection, he would have lost everything. This is real-world stuff that nobody teaches in school. Unfair advantage number 9. Retire young. With passive income streams established early, retirement isn't about reaching 65 and hoping your 401k lasted. Kiyosaki and his wife Kim retired in 1994 when she was 37 and he was 47. They retired specifically to test their investments. If they failed, they were young enough to recover. Instead, their investment succeeded, especially after the 2007 crash. Unfair advantage number 10. Use the law of compensation. This law states that compensation increases with experience and competence. But Kiyosaki adds a twist. It's not just about professional experience. It's about financial experience. Learning to raise capital, manage debt, acquire assets, minimize taxes. These skills compound over time, and the compensation increases dramatically. Now we're in part 4, the graduate school section, titled Be the Federal. This is where Kiyosaki explains how to essentially print your own money, legally. Before he gets into the how, he explains the 4 types of money throughout history. Commodity money, gold, silver, salt, livestock. Reserve money, IOUs backed by commodities. Fractional reserve money, lending out more IOUs than commodities held. Fiat money, money backed by nothing but government decree. After 1971, we've been operating on fiat money. The government can literally create money out of thin air. And when they do, 2 things happen. Taxes go up and inflation goes up. It's a double tax on poor and middle-class people. Kiyosaki's argument is this: if the government can print money, why can't you? Obviously not literally printing currency, but creating your own income streams that function like printed money. Here's his 3-step process. Step 1. Print your own fiat money. This means starting a business. In 1996, Kiyosaki started the Rich Dad Company with $250,000 from investors. Once the business was profitable, he paid back the investors with interest. Now the business operates in 55-plus countries, generating millions in revenue. Since all the original capital has been repaid, every dollar coming in is essentially printed money, an infinite return on investment. Step 2. Invest in real estate using fractional reserve money. This is where debt becomes your friend. For every dollar Kiyosaki invests in real estate, the bank lends him $4 or $5 more. So he gets a 4:1 or 5:1 leverage on his money. Then the goal is to get his original dollar back out through refinancing, leaving him with a property that's 100% financed by the bank, but producing cash flow that goes to him. He gives an example. He and Kim put $1 million down on an apartment complex. They improved it, increased the rents, and based on the higher income, the bank refinanced and gave them their $1 million back, tax-free because it's debt, not income. They still own the property, still receive the cash flow, but have none of their own money in it. That's an infinite return. Step 3. Convert cash flow to commodity money. With the passive income from businesses and real estate, Kiyosaki buys gold and silver. He doesn't save fiat currency that's declining in value. He converts excess cash flow into commodities that have held value for thousands of years. So he's reversed the history of money, starting with fiat currency, using it to acquire assets that produce cash flow, then converting that cash flow into commodity money. It's brilliant, actually. But here's my major criticism of this section. Kiyosaki makes it sound easier than it is. Just start a business, just buy investment property, just use leverage. Each of these steps takes years to learn, significant capital to start, high risk tolerance, and frankly, a lot of luck and timing. He started the Rich Dad Company in 1996 with $250,000. That's not pocket change. His real estate example involves putting down $1 million. How many people have that kind of capital? Yes, you can start smaller, and he mentioned starting with an $18,500 condo early in his career. But the path from $18,500 to $1 million to hundreds of millions isn't as straightforward as the book implies. That said, I appreciate that he's teaching the principles. Even if you can't do it at a scale, understanding these concepts changes how you think about money, assets, and wealth creation. All right, so let me tell you what I personally took away from reading this entire book. First, Kiyosaki is absolutely right that our education system fails to teach financial literacy, and that's a massive problem. Whether you agree with his politics or not, you can't deny that graduating students who don't understand credit, debt, investing, taxes, or entrepreneurship is a failure. We're setting kids up to be dependent employees at best and financial disasters at worst. Second, the CASHFLOW Quadrant framework is valuable. Understanding that there are different ways to earn income as an employee, self-employed professional, business owner, or investor, and that each has different financial implications, particularly regarding taxes, is crucial knowledge that most people never learn. Third, the concept of transforming ordinary income into passive income through assets is powerful. Even if you're not going to build a business empire or buy apartment complexes, the principle of acquiring assets that produce cash flow changes your entire relationship with money. Fourth, seeing both sides of every coin, understanding multiple perspectives, not just right/wrong thinking, is indeed a mark of intelligence. This goes beyond finance into life philosophy, and I think it's one of the most valuable lessons in the book. Fifth, the 3 windows of learning concept gives parents a framework for when and how to introduce different concepts to children. Starting financial education early, during that first quantum learning phase before age 12, gives kids a massive advantage. But I also learned some things from what the book got wrong or oversimplified. The book has a strong survivorship bias. It celebrates billionaire dropouts like Jobs and Gates, but ignores the thousands of dropouts who struggled. Yes, college isn't for everyone, but Kiyosaki sometimes makes it sound like college is actively harmful, which I don't think is fair. The politics are heavy-handed at times. Kiyosaki clearly has libertarian leanings, and his disdain for government programs and unions comes through strongly. You don't have to share his politics to benefit from his financial education advice, but he doesn't always separate the two well. The book sometimes conflates correlation with causation. Rich people often have certain characteristics and behaviors, but that doesn't necessarily mean those characteristics cause their wealth. There's luck, timing, connections, inherited advantages, and many other factors that Kiyosaki downplays. Risk is understated. Using leverage, starting businesses, investing in real estate. These all carry significant risk. Kiyosaki has lost money, gone bankrupt, and failed multiple times, which he mentions briefly. But the book focuses much more on successes than on the real possibility of failure and loss. Let me talk about what this book does really well. First, it challenges sacred cows. Kiyosaki isn't afraid to question deeply held beliefs about education, success, and wealth. Whether it's saying, your house isn't an asset, or savers are losers, or debt is good, he forces you to examine assumptions you might have held your whole life. Even if you ultimately disagree with him, the process of questioning is valuable. Second, it provides practical frameworks. The cash flow quadrant, the 3 types of income, the windows of learning, the BI triangle. These are mental models you can actually use. They're not just abstract theory. You can apply these concepts to evaluate your own financial situation and make decisions. Third, it's written for parents specifically. Most financial education books target individuals. This one is specifically designed to help parents teach their children, with action steps at the end of each chapter. The focus on starting early, during those critical windows of learning, is smart and well executed. Fourth, it integrates multiple domains. The book doesn't just talk about money in isolation. It connects financial education to psychology, emotional intelligence, spirituality, generosity versus greed, education theory, windows of learning, cone of learning, and real-world economics, tax policy, monetary policy. This holistic approach is more effective than just teaching technical financial skills. Fifth, it's accessible. Despite being about complex topics like tax code, debt structures, and monetary policy, Kiyosaki writes in a conversational, easy-to-understand style. He uses simple diagrams, memorable analogies like Monopoly, and clear examples. A parent doesn't need an MBA to understand and apply these concepts. Sixth, the games and tools. Kiyosaki created actual board games, CASHFLOW for Kids, CASHFLOW 101 and 202, that teach these concepts experientially. Learning through play, especially for children, is brilliant. The games aren't just add-ons. They're integral to his teaching method. Now let me be honest about what this book gets wrong or where it falls short. First, oversimplification of complex issues. Kiyosaki often presents complex economic and social issues in very black and white terms. Government equals bad, entrepreneurship equals good, employees equals victims, business owners equals enlightened, social programs equals creating dependency, capitalism equals always beneficial. Reality is much more nuanced than this. Second, the politics overshadow the education at times. Look, I get it. Money and politics are intertwined. But Kiyosaki's libertarian ideology is so prominent that it sometimes feels like you're reading a political manifesto rather than a financial education guide. His criticisms of Obama, unions, government workers, and social programs will alienate readers who might otherwise benefit from his financial teaching. Third, survivorship bias and risk understatement. The book celebrates successful entrepreneurs while largely ignoring failed ones. It talks about using massive leverage and debt as if it's straightforward, when in reality, many people who try this approach lose everything. The risks of entrepreneurship, leverage, and active investing are mentioned but downplayed. Fourth, privilege isn't addressed. Kiyosaki talks about his rich dad, who mentored him from age 9, gave him opportunities to learn about business, introduced him to advisors and professionals, etc. That's an enormous privilege that most kids don't have. He had a safety net, his poor dad with government income, while he experimented with entrepreneurship. Many people don't have that luxury. Fifth, some advice is outdated or questionable. The book was published in 2013, and some of the economic predictions and advice haven't aged well. Also, some strategies he recommends, like using credit cards to invest in real estate, are risky at best and potentially devastating at worst. Sixth, the middle class gets unfairly criticized. Kiyosaki sometimes seems to have disdain for middle-class values, stability, security, steady work. But these aren't character flaws. For many people, a stable middle-class life is a worthy goal and achievement. Not everyone can or should be an entrepreneur, and there's nothing wrong with that. Seventh, gender and diversity are barely addressed. The book talks a lot about his rich dad and poor dad and various male entrepreneurs and historical figures. Women are mentioned occasionally, but there's little discussion of how gender, race, or other factors might affect someone's ability to access capital, take risks, or build wealth. Eighth, the be the Fed concept is unrealistic for most people. The final section about printing your own money and using massive leverage to build wealth empires is aspirational, sure, but it's also completely out of reach for 95% of readers. Starting businesses that generate millions, getting million-dollar loans for investment properties. These aren't accessible strategies for average parents trying to teach their kids about money. All right, so here's my final take on why students work for C students. This is a flawed but important book that every parent should at least be aware of, even if you don't agree with everything in it. What Kiyosaki gets right. Financial literacy is criminally underemphasized in traditional education, and parents need to fill that gap. The earlier you start teaching kids about money, the better. Understanding the difference between assets and liabilities, between types of income, and between different paths to earning money gives children choices they wouldn't otherwise have. The skills required to get good grades are different from the skills required to build wealth. The tax code is designed to incentivize certain behaviors, and understanding this gives you enormous advantages. What Kiyosaki gets wrong. He oversimplifies complex issues, overstates the problems with traditional employment and middle-class values, understates the risks of entrepreneurship and leverage, and lets his political ideology overshadow the financial education at times. His solutions work great if you have capital, mentorship, risk tolerance, and yes, some luck. For many people, they're just not realistic. Who should read this book? Parents who want to teach their kids about money and don't know where to start. Anyone who feels like there's something missing from what they learned in school about money. Aspiring entrepreneurs who want to understand how business owners and investors think differently. People who are curious about alternative perspectives on education, success, and wealth. Anyone willing to be challenged on their assumptions about money, even if they ultimately disagree with Kiyosaki. Who should skip this book? People who will be offended by criticism of traditional education. There's a lot of it. Anyone who isn't open to questioning mainstream financial advice. People looking for get-rich-quick schemes. This is about education and mindset, not tactics. Anyone who can't separate useful financial concepts from political ideology they might disagree with. My rating. I'd give this book a 7 out of 10. It loses points for oversimplification, political bias, and unrealistic scaling. What works with millions doesn't necessarily work with thousands. But it gains points for tackling an important topic that nobody else addresses well, providing practical frameworks and tools, and genuinely attempting to help parents give their children advantages through financial education. Here's what I'd recommend. Read this book with a critical mind. Take the concepts about financial education, different types of income, assets versus liabilities, and teaching children about money. Those are gold. Be skeptical of the political commentary and the anyone can do this implications. Filter the advice through your own circumstances, values, and risk tolerance. And most importantly, don't just read it. Do something with it. Start teaching your kids about money. Play the cash flow game with them. Discuss real-world money situations in your family. Show them your financial statement. Talk about the different quadrants. Help them understand that there are multiple paths to success, not just the good grades, good college, good job conveyor belt. Because here's the thing. Whether you agree with Kiyosaki's solutions or not, the problem he identifies is real. Kids are leaving school financially illiterate. They don't understand money, debt, investing, taxes, or entrepreneurship. They're unprepared for the economic realities they'll face. And if schools aren't going to teach them, parents have to step up. This book gives you a roadmap for doing that. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point. So that's my comprehensive review of why students work for C students. I spent about 8 hours reading this cover to cover, and another several hours researching some of the claims and thinking through the implications. If you found this helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I do these long-form book reviews regularly, and I'd love to know what you think about this format. Drop a comment below. Do you agree with Kiyosaki? Disagree? Have you read the book yourself? I'd love to hear your perspective. Also, let me know what book you'd like me to review next. I'm always looking for suggestions, especially in the areas of finance, business, personal development, and education. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.